Stop chasing, because the harder you run after what you want, the faster it seems to disappear. But the moment you stop, everything begins moving toward you. This sounds impossible until you understand one hidden law of the human mind, a law that explains why desperate people are overlooked, while those who appear calm and unattached become unforgettable. Stay until the end, because what you're about to discover may completely change the way you pursue success, love, and your future. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, what is one thing you've been chasing for far too long? Love, money, success, or someone's approval? Sometimes simply naming what controls us is the first step toward freedom. Now let's go deeper. Most people believe they are chasing a dream, a relationship, success, or recognition because they genuinely want it. But beneath that pursuit, something far more powerful is often at work. The human mind has a remarkable ability to disguise emotional needs as personal ambitions. What appears to be determination may actually be a silent attempt to fill an inner void that has existed for years. This is why some people achieve exactly what they once desired, only to discover that the feeling of emptiness remains unchanged. The external goal was never the true destination. It was only a symbol carrying the hope that it would repair something within. When a person feels incomplete, every achievement becomes emotionally overloaded. A promotion is expected to create self-worth. A relationship is expected to erase loneliness. Praise is expected to silence self-doubt. These expectations place an impossible burden on the outside world. No person, possession, or accomplishment can permanently satisfy an inner hunger that was created by neglect, fear, or the belief that one's value depends on constant validation. The more intensely someone pursues these external answers, the more they unknowingly reinforce the belief that fulfillment exists somewhere beyond themselves. This creates a painful cycle. The mind begins believing that happiness always lies one step ahead, hidden behind the next opportunity, the next relationship, or the next milestone. Every success brings only temporary relief before another desire takes its place. The chase never truly ends because the source of dissatisfaction was never external to begin with. It quietly lives in the unconscious, influencing decisions, expectations, and emotional reactions without being recognized. Real transformation begins when a person pauses long enough to ask a different question. Instead of asking, "How do I get what I want?" they begin asking, "What feeling am I hoping this will give me?" That single moment of honest reflection changes everything. It reveals that peace, security, love, and self-respect are not rewards waiting at the finish line. They are qualities that must first be cultivated within. Once the inner emptiness begins to heal, desire no longer comes from desperation. It comes from wholeness, and that quiet shift changes the way every opportunity, relationship, and experience enters one's life. Have you ever noticed that the things you desperately try to avoid often seem to follow you, while the things you pursue with relentless intensity appear to slip further away? This is not merely bad luck or coincidence. It reflects a subtle pattern within the human mind. Whatever receives the greatest emotional charge begins to dominate your thoughts, your decisions, and even your perception of reality. The more energy you invest in resisting fear or obsessively pursuing a desire, the more power you unknowingly give it. When fear controls the mind, it creates a state of constant tension. Every decision becomes a reaction rather than a conscious choice. A person afraid of rejection begins to overanalyze every conversation. Someone terrified of failure hesitates before every opportunity, trying to eliminate every possible mistake. Ironically, these protective behaviors often produce the very outcomes they hoped to prevent. Anxiety changes posture, tone of voice, facial expressions, and behavior in ways that others can sense, even if they cannot explain why. The unconscious communicates through countless subtle signals long before words are spoken. The same principle applies to obsessive pursuit. When someone believes their happiness depends entirely on obtaining one specific person, achievement, or outcome, they become emotionally attached to the result. Every delay feels unbearable. Every obstacle becomes proof that something is wrong. Instead of acting with clarity, they begin acting from fear of loss. This emotional pressure clouds judgment, narrows perspective, and often pushes opportunities away rather than drawing them closer. The unconscious mind does not simply respond to what you consciously want. It responds to the emotional state beneath that desire. If the deeper message is, "I am incomplete until this happens," then every action carries the weight of insecurity. But when that emotional dependency begins to dissolve, something remarkable changes. You no longer resist life, and you no longer attempt to force it. Your attention becomes grounded in the present instead of trapped in imagined futures. This shift does not guarantee that every wish will immediately come true. It changes something even more important. You stop allowing fear and obsession to dictate your identity. From that place of inner freedom, your decisions become calmer, your presence becomes stronger, and your opportunities are no longer filtered through desperation. What once controlled your life gradually loses its grip, not because the world changed overnight, but because the unconscious patterns guiding your behavior finally began to change. Many people misunderstand detachment. They assume it means becoming cold, indifferent, or no longer caring about the people and dreams that matter. In reality, true detachment has nothing to do with emotional withdrawal. It is the quiet decision to stop allowing your peace of mind to depend on outcomes you cannot completely control. It is not the absence of desire, but the absence of desperation. There is a profound difference between wanting something and believing you cannot be whole without it. When your sense of worth becomes attached to a specific result, you unknowingly surrender your inner authority. Your emotions begin rising and falling according to circumstances rather than your own inner stability. A delayed opportunity feels like personal failure. Someone else's opinion begins shaping your confidence. Rejection starts defining your identity instead of simply becoming an experience. Little by little, the outside world becomes the ruler of your inner life. You may appear to be in control, yet every unexpected event has the power to disturb your balance. Inner authority begins the moment you reclaim responsibility for your emotional state. Instead of asking the world to constantly reassure you, you become the source of your own steadiness. You still pursue meaningful goals, build relationships, and welcome success, but you no longer treat them as proof of your value. Your identity is no longer borrowed from achievements or approval. It is rooted in a deeper understanding of who you are, independent of temporary victories or disappointments. This shift changes the way you move through life. Decisions become clearer because they are no longer clouded by fear of losing something. Conversations become more genuine because you are no longer trying to earn acceptance. Challenges become opportunities for growth instead of threats to your self-worth. Others often sense this quiet confidence without being able to explain it. There is a calm strength in people who no longer need to prove themselves. Their presence carries a sense of stability that cannot be manufactured through performance or appearances. Detachment, then, is not an escape from life. It is a return to yourself. It allows you to participate fully without becoming emotionally imprisoned by every result. When you reclaim your inner authority, the world no longer decides whether you deserve peace. You carry that peace with you, and from that foundation, your actions become wiser, your relationships healthier, and your ambitions far more sustainable because they arise from freedom rather than fear. Most people assume that change begins with visible actions, but the deepest transformations occur long before anyone notices them. Beneath every habit, every decision, and every emotional reaction lies the unconscious mind, silently shaping the direction of your life. It pays less attention to the words you speak than to the emotional patterns you repeatedly experience. This is why two people can pursue the same goal with equal effort, yet produce entirely different results. Their actions may appear similar, but the unconscious intentions driving those actions are not. When fear becomes the hidden force behind your choices, the unconscious organizes your behavior around protection rather than possibility. You begin seeking certainty instead of growth, approval instead of authenticity, and control instead of trust. Even when you consciously tell yourself that you deserve success, love, or abundance, a deeper emotional pattern may still whisper that these things are unsafe or unattainable. This inner conflict creates hesitation, inconsistency, and self-sabotage. The conscious mind pulls forward while the unconscious quietly applies the brakes. Something remarkable happens when fear no longer occupies the center of your emotional life. The unconscious begins responding to a completely different message. Instead of preparing for rejection, it becomes open to connection. Instead of expecting disappointment, it allows curiosity to replace anxiety. This does not happen because you force yourself to think positively. It happens because your relationship with uncertainty changes. You no longer treat every unknown outcome as a threat to your identity. You begin meeting life with greater openness rather than constant defense. As this inner shift develops, your behavior naturally transforms. You speak with greater confidence because your words are no longer filtered through the fear of being judged. You make decisions with greater clarity because your attention is no longer consumed by imaginary worst-case scenarios. Opportunities that once seemed overwhelming begin to feel manageable because your energy is invested in responding instead of reacting. Even your relationships improve because people often feel safer around someone whose emotional state is grounded rather than driven by hidden insecurity. The unconscious is always listening, not to your promises, but to your emotional habits. When those habits are rooted in fear, your world becomes narrow and guarded. When they are rooted in calm awareness, your world quietly expands. This is why genuine transformation is never about pretending to be fearless. It is about understanding fear without allowing it to become the author of your decisions. Once that happens, the unconscious stops resisting your path and begins working with you instead of against you. Many people spend years trying to become more attractive by changing how they look, how they speak, or how others perceive them. They believe that if they can impress enough people, the right opportunities and relationships will naturally appear. Yet there is a strange paradox in human nature. The people who leave the deepest impression are rarely the ones trying the hardest to be noticed. They are the ones who have become deeply connected to who they truly are. Authenticity possesses a quiet strength that performance can never imitate. When a person constantly seeks approval, they begin shaping their identity around the expectations of others. They hide opinions that might create disagreement, suppress emotions that seem inconvenient, and imitate qualities they believe others admire. At first, this may appear successful because it often earns temporary acceptance, but beneath the surface, it creates exhaustion. Maintaining a version of yourself that exists only to satisfy other people requires endless emotional effort. Eventually, the fear of being rejected becomes stronger than the desire to be understood, and genuine connection becomes almost impossible. Authenticity begins where performance ends. It is the willingness to let your words, values, and actions reflect the person you truly are, instead of the person you believe others expect. This does not mean expressing every thought without restraint or refusing to grow. It means allowing your decisions to arise from inner conviction rather than constant comparison. When your identity is no longer built upon external approval, something subtle changes in the way you move through life. You become calmer because you are no longer managing countless masks. Your confidence becomes steadier because it no longer depends on applause. People are naturally drawn to this kind of presence, not because authenticity guarantees popularity, but because it creates trust. Others instinctively recognize consistency between what you say, what you feel, and how you behave. Relationships become deeper because they are built on honesty rather than performance. Opportunities often emerge because genuine people communicate with clarity, accept responsibility, and inspire confidence without forcing it. Their energy feels stable rather than desperate, open rather than manipulative. Ironically, the less you chase admiration, the more respect you often receive. The less you struggle to convince others of your value, the more naturally your value becomes visible. Authenticity is not a strategy for attracting success, love, or recognition. It is the natural expression of someone who has stopped abandoning themselves in order to gain the approval of the world. And it is from that place of inner alignment that meaningful opportunities and lasting relationships most often begin to unfold. In a world that constantly rewards speed, noise, and endless activity, silence is often mistaken for weakness. People assume that if you are not constantly proving yourself, explaining your intentions, or chasing recognition, you must be falling behind. Yet some of the greatest transformations happen in complete silence. Just as a seed grows beneath the soil long before anyone sees the first sign of life, the human mind undergoes its most meaningful changes away from applause and attention. Silence is not empty. It is the space where awareness becomes stronger than distraction. Patience is equally misunderstood. Many believe it means waiting passively for life to improve, but true patience is an active state of inner trust. It is continuing to grow, learn, and move forward without demanding immediate results. When every action is driven by urgency, the mind becomes trapped in the future. It loses the ability to fully engage with the present moment. Decisions become rushed, emotions become unstable, and every delay feels like failure. Patience frees you from this endless pressure by reminding you that meaningful growth follows its own rhythm, not your preferred timeline. Self-awareness is what gives both silence and patience their true power. Without understanding yourself, silence becomes loneliness and patience becomes frustration. But when you begin observing your own thoughts instead of immediately believing them, a profound shift occurs. You start recognizing the fears that have been directing your behavior, the habits that keep repeating, and the emotional patterns that silently shape your relationships. Instead of reacting automatically, you create space between impulse and action. In that space, wisdom begins to replace habit. This inner steadiness creates something that cannot be manufactured through appearance or performance. It creates presence. Presence is the quiet confidence that comes from being fully rooted in yourself. People often notice it without knowing why. They feel heard because you truly listen. They trust your words because they are not rushed or exaggerated. Your calmness becomes reassuring in situations where others are overwhelmed by anxiety or impatience. This is the kind of influence that does not demand attention, yet naturally receives it. When you stop filling every silence with unnecessary words, every delay with unnecessary worry, and every uncertainty with unnecessary fear, something unexpected happens. Your energy becomes focused instead of scattered. Your decisions become intentional instead of impulsive. And your life begins reflecting a deeper kind of strength, one that is not built on constant effort to be seen, but on the quiet certainty of knowing who you are, regardless of who is watching. Many people believe that reality is shaped only by external circumstances. They assume that if their environment changes, their life will finally improve. But one of the most overlooked truths about the human mind is that perception comes before behavior, and behavior gradually shapes experience. Two people can stand in the same room, face the same challenge, and encounter the same opportunity, yet walk away with completely different outcomes. The difference often lies not in the situation itself, but in the meaning each person unconsciously assigns to it. Perception acts like an invisible lens through which every experience is filtered. If you believe the world is constantly judging you, even neutral expressions begin to look like criticism. If you expect rejection, moments of silence feel like abandonment. If you believe that success belongs only to others, every obstacle becomes evidence that you should stop trying. These interpretations happen so quickly that they often feel like objective reality, yet they are deeply influenced by past experiences, emotional wounds, and unconscious beliefs that have been carried for years without question. This is why inner transformation changes external reality in ways that seem almost mysterious. When your perception begins to shift, your behavior changes naturally. You approach conversations with greater openness instead of defensiveness. You recognize opportunities where you once noticed only risks. You become willing to act despite uncertainty because failure no longer defines your identity. The world may not have changed overnight, but your relationship with it has. And because your actions are different, the responses you receive from others also begin to change. Consider someone who has spent years believing they are not worthy of respect. Without realizing it, they may avoid eye contact, hesitate before expressing opinions, or accept treatment that violates their boundaries. These behaviors quietly reinforce the very belief that created them. But when that person begins seeing themselves as inherently valuable, their posture changes, their voice becomes steadier, and their choices become more intentional. Others often respond with greater respect, not because the world suddenly became kinder, but because the signals they communicate have fundamentally changed. This is the hidden power of inner transformation. It is not about imagining a different reality or denying life's challenges. It is about recognizing that the unconscious lens through which you interpret the world influences every decision you make. When that lens becomes clearer, your behavior aligns with confidence rather than fear, possibility rather than limitation. Over time, this alignment creates a life that feels different from the inside out, proving that lasting change rarely begins with the world around you. It begins with the way you choose to see it. The greatest misunderstanding about fulfillment is the belief that it exists somewhere in the future, waiting behind the next achievement, the next relationship, or the next moment of recognition. From an early age, many people are taught to believe that happiness is a reward earned through accomplishment. They spend years climbing one mountain after another, convinced that peace lies just beyond the next summit. Yet when they finally arrive, the satisfaction they expected often fades far more quickly than they imagined. Another goal appears, another desire emerges, and the cycle quietly begins again. This endless pursuit is not created by ambition itself. Healthy ambition inspires growth, creativity, and meaningful contribution. The problem arises when inner peace becomes dependent on external success. In that moment, every accomplishment carries an impossible responsibility. It must not only improve your life, but also convince you that you are finally enough. No achievement, however extraordinary, can permanently fulfill a need that belongs to your inner world. The search continues because the destination was never external in the first place. Peace, security, love, and self-respect are often treated as prizes that life hands to those who prove themselves worthy. Yet these qualities are not rewards waiting at the finish line. They are inner capacities that must be cultivated regardless of circumstances. A person who learns to value themselves without constant approval experiences relationships differently. A person who develops inner peace without depending on perfect conditions approaches challenges with greater resilience. Their emotional stability is no longer determined by temporary victories or inevitable disappointments. When these qualities begin growing within, desire itself changes. You still pursue meaningful goals, but your motivation no longer comes from fear of being incomplete. You work because creation brings purpose, not because success defines your identity. You love because your heart is open, not because another person must rescue you from loneliness. You welcome opportunities because they enrich your life, not because they determine your worth. This subtle shift transforms every pursuit into an expression of wholeness rather than an attempt to escape emptiness. Ironically, this is often the moment when life begins offering what once seemed impossible to attain, not because the universe suddenly changes its rules, but because you have changed your relationship with yourself. Fulfillment no longer waits in some distant future. It becomes the quiet foundation from which every choice, every relationship, and every ambition naturally grows. When you stop searching for your value outside yourself, you discover that the peace you were chasing had been waiting within you all along. Perhaps the greatest paradox of life is this: the moment you stop trying to force everything into place, life begins arranging itself in ways you never expected. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because you do. The desperate need to control every outcome slowly dissolves, replaced by a quiet confidence that no longer depends on certainty. And from that inner stillness, your choices become wiser, your relationships become healthier, and your opportunities become clearer. This does not mean you stop dreaming. It does not mean you abandon your ambitions or refuse to take action. It means your actions are no longer driven by fear, insecurity, or the need to prove your worth. You continue moving forward, but you do so from a place of wholeness rather than emptiness. There is a profound difference between pursuing a goal because it reflects who you are and chasing it because you believe it will finally make you enough. Remember, the world often mirrors the relationship you have with yourself. When you seek approval from everyone, you lose sight of your own voice. When you cling to outcomes, anxiety becomes your constant companion. But when you cultivate inner peace, authenticity, patience, and self-awareness, you create a presence that naturally attracts trust, respect, and meaningful opportunities. What once felt impossible begins to unfold, not through force, but through alignment. So, release the exhausting habit of chasing everything that runs away from you. Invest that energy in understanding yourself, strengthening your character, and becoming someone who is complete, even in uncertainty. The more deeply you know yourself, the less you need the world to constantly reassure you. And strangely enough, that is often when the right people arrive, the right doors open, and the right paths reveal themselves. If this message resonated with you, write "I choose peace over pursuit" in the comments. It is more than a sentence. It is a commitment to stop living from fear and start living from inner freedom. Because in the end, the things truly meant for you rarely need to be chased. They are recognized, welcomed, and received by the person you become when you finally stop running after everything outside yourself and begin discovering everything that has been waiting within.